Hello everyone and welcome back to Shadow Man Stories. I can picture some of you already in bed, maybe some of you just getting home from work. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I'm glad you're here. If this helps you relax or sleep, please like and subscribe. It means a lot. Now, let's get you comfortable, and I'll tell you tonight's story. My name is Rebecca Moonshiner, and I never believed in mountain devils until I saw what crawled out of that still. People always laugh when they hear my last name. They think it's some kind of joke, like my family was running moonshine in these Kentucky hills for generations. Truth is, we never touched the stuff. My great-grandfather was a preacher who got killed by federal agents back in 1925, shot dead because they thought he was hiding a still in his church basement. He wasn't. The only thing he was hiding was a root cellar full of potatoes. That's the funny thing about names. Sometimes they stick to you for all the wrong reasons. I've been a forest ranger for 12 years now, working the Daniel Boone National Forest. Most days, it's peaceful work. Checking hiking trails, watching for fires, making sure campers don't leave their trash behind. But sometimes, like in November of 1989, you get called to investigate something that makes you wish you'd picked a different job. The call came in on a Tuesday morning. Reports of illegal moonshine operations up in Copper Creek Valley, deep in the Red River Gorge area. Nothing new there. Folks have been making white lightning in these caves for 200 years. What made this different was the other reports. Strange smells, screaming in the night, workers running away from their own operation, talking about deals with the devil. My partner on this job was Marcus Stone, a federal agent with the ATF. He was one of those city boys who came down from Louisville thinking he knew everything about mountain people. 35 years old, clean-shaven, and wearing a suit that cost more than I made in a month. He had this way of looking at you like you were some kind of backward hillbilly. "So, Ranger Moonshiner," he said when we met at the trailhead, "I guess you know all about illegal liquor, huh?" He thought he was being funny. "I know enough," I said, checking my radio and service weapon. "I know it's usually just regular folks trying to make some extra money, and I know the people who drink it aren't usually the ones screaming in terror." Marcus just shrugged. "Probably gang violence. These mountain operations are getting more dangerous. Drug cartels moving in." The trail to Copper Creek Valley was 5 miles of rough hiking. No roads, no phone lines, just an old deer path winding through thick forest and limestone cliffs. Perfect place to hide something you didn't want found. The November air was cold and sharp, threatening snow. Our breath came out in white puffs as we climbed. I'd grown up in these woods. I knew which plants were safe to eat, which springs had the cleanest water, which caves stayed warm in winter. My daddy taught me to read animal tracks, and my mama showed me how to find my way home by the stars. This was my territory. But as we got deeper into the valley, something felt wrong. The forest was too quiet. No bird calls, no squirrels chattering in the trees. Even the insects seemed to have disappeared. Our footsteps on the frozen leaves sounded too loud, like the whole forest was holding its breath. "You notice anything strange?" I asked Marcus. He looked around and shrugged. "Seems normal to me. Just trees and rocks." That was the difference between us. He saw what was there. I saw what wasn't. We found the first signs around noon. Broken branches, boot prints in the mud, the smell of sour mash hanging in the air like a ghost. Someone had been making moonshine here recently, but the trail felt cold, old. "This way," I said, following the prints toward a cluster of limestone caves. Looks like they were using the caves to hide their operation. The mouth of Copper Creek Cave yawned open like a hungry mouth. Cool air drifted out, carrying smells that made my stomach turn. Not just the usual cave smells of damp earth and bat droppings. Something else. Something sweet and rotten, like fruit left too long in the sun. Marcus pulled out his flashlight. "Let's go, see what we can find." I checked my own light and radio. The radio crackled with static, then went silent. "Radio's not working," I said. "Mountains always mess up the signal," Marcus said. "Come on." As we stepped into the cave, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Call it woman's intuition, call it mountain sense, call it whatever you want. Something in that cave didn't want us there. Our flashlight beams cut through the darkness, revealing smooth stone walls and a path that led deeper into the earth. About 50 yards in, we found what we were looking for. The moonshine operation was there, all right, but it looked like something out of a nightmare. The still was set up in a wide chamber about the size of a small house. Copper pipes twisted through the air like metal snakes, connecting boilers and condensers in a maze that hurt to look at. But it was the way everything was arranged that made me stop dead in my tracks. The equipment wasn't just functional, it was artistic, decorative. The pipes formed patterns that looked almost like symbols, curving and spiraling in ways that served no practical purpose. The barrels were placed in perfect circles, like some kind of ritual, and carved into the cave walls, barely visible in our flashlight beams, were symbols I didn't recognize. "Well, I'll be damned," Marcus said, walking around the setup. "This is some sophisticated operation. Look at this copper work. This isn't your typical backwoods still." I was looking at something else. Dark stains on the stone floor that looked suspiciously like dried blood, and scratch marks on the walls, like someone, or something, had been trying to claw their way out. "Marcus," I said, "look at this." He came over and knelt beside me, shining his light on the stains. "Could be anything, rust from the equipment, bat droppings." "Bats don't bleed rust," I said. "You." "All right," he admitted. "But let's not jump to conclusions. Could be these guys got into a fight with some competitors. Wouldn't be the first time." I wanted to believe that. I really did. But as we explored deeper into the chamber, I found things that didn't make sense. Personal belongings scattered around like people had left in a hurry. A work boot with no owner, a jacket torn to shreds, and everywhere, that sweet rotten smell getting stronger. The strangest thing was the moonshine itself. 3 barrels sat at the center of the operation, full to the brim with clear liquid. But when I got close, the smell made my head spin. It didn't smell like any moonshine I'd ever encountered. It smelled like flowers and sulfur, like a church and a graveyard mixed together. "We should test this," I said, pulling out a small sample bottle. "Good idea," Marcus agreed. "Send it to the lab, see what they're putting in it." But when I tried to take a sample, something impossible happened. The liquid moved away from my bottle, rippling and swirling like it was alive, like it was trying to avoid being captured. "Did you see that?" I asked. Marcus was examining the copper pipes. "See what?" "The moonshine. It moved." He looked over at me with that expression he used when he thought I was being a simple mountain girl. "Liquid moves, Rebecca. It's called physics." I tried again, and again the liquid seemed to pull away from my bottle. This time I was sure of it. But when Marcus came over to try, the liquid stayed perfectly still while he filled his sample container. "See?" he said. "No problem." That night, we made camp outside the cave. Standard procedure when investigating a crime scene. You don't want to contaminate evidence by sleeping in it. But as we sat around our small campfire, eating cold sandwiches and drinking coffee from a thermos, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The forest was still too quiet, and every now and then, I caught a whiff of that sweet rotten smell, even though we were 100 yards from the cave entrance. "Tell me about the missing workers," I said to Marcus. He pulled out a file folder. 3 men, local guys, all experienced with moonshine operations. Jimmy Watson, age 24, Bobby Lee Carver, age 31, and Ezra Whitman, age 45. Their families reported them missing 5 days ago. Any of them have reason to run off? Watson owed some gambling debts. Carver was married to a woman who didn't know about his moonshine work. Whitman. Marcus paused. Whitman's wife said something strange, said he'd been talking about making a deal with the devil for the perfect recipe. The devil? That's what she said. Thought he was drinking too much of his own product. Marcus closed the file. People say all kinds of crazy things when their loved ones disappear. I was about to respond when we heard it. A sound drifting out of the cave like an echo from hell itself. The unmistakable sound of a moonshine still in operation, The bubble and hiss of boiling mash, the drip of condensation, the creak of copper pipes under pressure. But we'd seen that still. It was cold, empty, not running. Marcus jumped to his feet, grabbing his flashlight. "Someone's down there." "Wait," I said, but he was already heading toward the cave entrance. The sounds got louder as we approached. Now we could hear other things too. Voices, laughter, the clink of glass bottles. It sounded like a full operation running at peak capacity. But when we got to the chamber, our flashlights revealed the same cold, empty equipment we'd found before. The pipes were dark. The boilers were cold to the touch, no sign of recent use, and yet the sounds continued. All around us, invisible workers seemed to be running a moonshine operation that existed only in the air. Marcus's face went pale. "What the hell is going on here?" That's when I smelled it again. That sweet, rotten smell, but stronger now. And mixed with it was something else. Something that reminded me of the sulfur smell you get when you strike a match. "We need to get out of here," I said. But Marcus was already walking deeper into the cave, following the sounds that seemed to echo from the walls themselves. There has to be an explanation. Hidden rooms, some kind of acoustic trick. I followed him because I had to, but every instinct I'd inherited from generations of mountain people was screaming at me to run. That's when we found the fourth barrel. It was sitting in a side chamber we'd missed before, and it was different from the others. Older. Made of wood instead of metal, with iron bands that looked like they'd been forged by hand. And carved into the wood, in letters that seemed to glow in our flashlight beams, was a single word: devil. The wooden barrel sat in the middle of the chamber like it had been waiting for us. The air around it shimmered with heat, even though the rest of the cave was cold enough to see our breath. And the sounds, the phantom moonshine operation, seemed to be coming from inside it. "Don't touch that," I said, but Marcus was already reaching for the lid. "It's just a barrel, Rebecca. There's got to be a logical explanation for all this." The moment his fingers made contact with the wood, two things happened. The sound stopped completely, leaving us in a silence so deep it hurt our ears, and Marcus screamed. He jerked his hand back like he'd been burned, but I could see frost forming on his fingertips. "It's freezing," he gasped. But it felt like fire. I grabbed his hand to look at it. His fingers were white with frostbite, but underneath the white, I could see red marks like burns. Impossible. But there it was. "We're leaving," I said. "Right now." But as we turned to go, we heard something that made my blood freeze. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from deeper in the cave, and with them, a voice sounded, singing an old mountain song I recognized from my childhood. "Come all you fair and tender ladies, take warning how you court young men. They're like the stars on a summer morning. They first appear and then they're gone." The voice was beautiful and terrible at the same time. It sounded like it was coming from the barrel, but also from the walls, but also from inside my own head. Marcus pulled out his service weapon. "Federal agents, come out with your hands visible." The singing stopped. Then we heard laughter, low and mean, echoing from every direction at once. "You boys sure are brave," said a voice that definitely wasn't the singer. This one was rough, with a mountain accent so thick it was hard to understand. "Coming down here to mess with things that ain't your business. Show yourself," Marcus shouted. Instead of an answer, we got a wind that couldn't exist in an underground cave. It came rushing through the chamber, carrying that sweet, rotten smell and something else. The sound of battle. Gunshots, screams, the clash of steel on steel. For just a moment, our flashlight beams showed us impossible things. Men in Revolutionary War uniforms fighting with knives and tomahawks, blood on the cave walls, bodies falling in the darkness. Then it was gone, and we were alone again with the barrel and the terrible silence. "We're getting out of here," I said, grabbing Marcus by the arm, but he was staring at the barrel with a strange expression on his face. "Did you see them? The soldiers?" "I saw something. That's why we need to leave." "But it was real. The Revolutionary War. It happened right here." His voice sounded dreamy, distant. I could feel their fear, their pain. I looked at him more closely and realized his pupils were dilated. His breathing was slow and deep, like he was in some kind of trance. "Marcus, look at me. We need to get out of this cave right now." He blinked and seemed to come back to himself. Yeah, you're right. This place. Something's not right about this place." We made it out of the cave and back to our camp. Whoa, I could tell something had changed in Marcus. He kept looking back at the cave entrance, and every few minutes he'd touch his frost-bitten fingers to his nose and inhale deeply, like he was trying to recapture some scent. The next morning, I hiked down to the nearest town to use a phone and call for backup. But when I got to the sheriff's office, I learned something that made my stomach drop. "You said you were looking for Jimmy Watson, Bobby Lee Carver, and Ezra Whitman?" Sheriff Coleman asked, looking through his files. "That's right, missing persons case." "Well, I got some bad news and some weird news. Bad news is, we found Jimmy Watson yesterday. Turned up in a field about 10 miles from Copper Creek, naked as the day he was born and crazier than a loon. He's in the county hospital now." "What's he saying?" "That's the weird news. He only speaks in some kind of old English, like Shakespeare or something. Keeps talking about King George and colonial rebels. Doc thinks he had some kind of breakdown." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November weather. "Can I talk to him?" "You can try, but I'm warning you he ain't making much sense." Jimmy Watson was strapped to a hospital bed, staring at the ceiling and muttering in a voice that didn't sound like his own. When I walked into the room, he looked at me with eyes that seemed too old for his 24-year-old face. "Another colonial spy," he said in an accent that belonged to the 1700s. "Come to steal His Majesty's rightful property." "Jimmy, it's me, Rebecca Moonshiner. I'm here to help you." He laughed, but it wasn't Jimmy's laugh. It was the laugh of a man who'd seen too much death. "Moonshiner? Fitting name for a rebel. Tell me, where have you hidden the still? His Majesty's revenue must be paid." I leaned closer. "What happened in the cave, Jimmy? What did you see?" His face went pale. "The devil. Us bargain. Ezra made the devil's bargain. He said the spirits would bless our work, make us rich beyond dreams. But the price..." He grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. "The price was our souls, and now the British officer collects what's owed." "What British officer?" "Captain Morrison. Died in the massacre of 1780. 30 settlers slaughtered in Copper Creek Cave, including women and children. His blood soaked into the stone, and now he rises to claim what King George never could. He uses our moonshine to possess the living, to continue his war against colonial rebels." Jimmy's grip tightened. "He's in your partner now. I can smell the devil's liquor on him." I pulled free and ran back to my truck, driving as fast as I dared on the winding mountain roads. But when I got back to our camp, Marcus was gone. And so was my sample of the moonshine from the barrel. I found him in the cave, sitting in front of the wooden barrel and drinking straight from a mason jar filled with that impossible moonshine. His eyes were different now, harder, colder, filled with an anger that didn't belong to him. "Marcus?" I said carefully. He looked up at me and smiled, but it wasn't Marcus's smile. "Ranger Moonshiner. How perfectly appropriate. Tell me, rebel, do you know the penalty for treason against the crown?" The man wearing Marcus Stone's face stood up slowly, still holding the mason jar of devil's moonshine. But everything about him was wrong. He stood straighter, like a soldier at attention. His voice carried a British accent that got thicker with every word. And his eyes held the cold fury of a man who'd been dead for over 200 years. "Captain James Morrison," he said, introducing himself with a formal bow, "His Majesty's 15th Regiment of Foot. And you, I presume, are another colonial rebel in need of correction." I kept my voice steady, even though my heart was hammering against my ribs. "Where's Marcus? What did you do to Agent Stone?" "Your federal agent is quite safe," Morrison said, taking another sip from the jar. He merely shares his vessel with one who has unfinished business in these rebellious colonies. I could see Marcus fighting somewhere behind those changed eyes. Sometimes his face would flicker, like someone switching between radio stations, and I'd catch a glimpse of the real Marcus trying to break through. But the possession was strong, fed by whatever supernatural poison was in that moonshine. The Revolutionary War ended over 200 years ago, I said. America won. It's over. Morrison's laugh was like breaking glass. Over? Over? I died in this very cave, along with 30 of His Majesty's loyal subjects, butchered by your savage ancestors. My war will never be over until every colonial rebel pays the price. That's when I understood. The cave paintings I'd seen, the ritual arrangements of the moonshine equipment. Ezra Whitman and his partners hadn't just been making illegal liquor. They'd been trying to use supernatural methods to improve their recipe, and they'd accidentally awakened something that should have stayed buried. The moonshine, I said. It's how you possess people. Clever girl. Morrison raised the jar in a mock toast. Alcohol has always been a gateway for spirits, but this particular vintage, distilled with the blood of the innocent and blessed by powers older than your Christian God, allows for more permanent arrangements. I thought about Jimmy Watson in the hospital, speaking in an old English accent. How many people have you possessed? Every soul who drinks from my barrel becomes a soldier in the King's army. Soon, I'll have enough troops to begin reclaiming these colonies for the crown. I could see my service weapon on Morrison's hip, Marcus's weapon, which was now in the hands of a vengeful ghost from the 1700s. I had my own gun, but I didn't want to shoot Marcus's body unless I had no other choice. The barrel, I said. That's your Anne. Chore, isn't it? That's how you stay in this world. Morrison's eyes narrowed. You know more than you should, rebel. My great-grandfather told stories, I lied, about the old ways, about how to fight spirits. The truth was, I was guessing. But Jimmy Watson had mentioned Ezra making a devil's bargain, and every mountain story I'd ever heard about dealing with supernatural forces had the same theme. There was always a way to break the contract, if you were brave enough and smart enough to find it. Morrison set down the jar and drew Marcus's service weapon. Then you know how dangerous it is to interfere with powers beyond your understanding. I backed toward the wooden barrel, trying to look scared and defeated. It wasn't hard. I was scared. But I was also angry. This thing was using my partner's body, threatening my forest, and corrupting something that had been sacred to my people for generations. The Cherokee knew about this place, I said, still backing away. They knew about the cave, about the water. That's why they considered it sacred. Savage superstitions, Morrison sneered. But he was following me, which was what I wanted. Not superstitions, wisdom. I was almost to the barrel now. They knew some places were doorways, and they knew how to close them. Morrison raised the gun. Enough talk, rebel. That's when Marcus fought back. I could see it happening. The real Marcus wrestling for control of his own body. His gun hand wavered, and sweat broke out on his forehead as he fought against the possession. Rebecca, he gasped in his own voice. The barrel. You have to break. Morrison slammed back into control, but those few seconds were all I needed. I grabbed the wooden barrel and tipped it over, spilling the supernatural moonshine across the cave floor. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The spilled liquor burst into flames that burned cold and blue, and from the flames came screams. Not just Morrison's voice, but dozens of voices, all the souls he'd trapped over the years. The cave filled with the sounds of battle, the clash of weapons, the cries of the dying. Marcus roared in fury and lunged at me, but now he was fighting on two fronts, against me and against Marcus, who was using every ounce of willpower to resist the spirit's control. I rolled away from his charge and came up near my backpack, where I'd stored something I'd picked up in town. A bottle of water from Tuckahoe Spring, a Cherokee sacred site about 20 miles from here. The old Cherokee woman who sold it to me had smiled when I told her where I was going. Sacred water fights sacred evil, she'd said, but only if your heart is pure. I'd bought it as insurance, not really believing. Now I unscrewed the cap and threw the sacred water onto the burning moonshine. The flames turned from blue to white-hot, and Morrison screamed like a wounded animal. His hold on Marcus wavered, and I could see my partner fighting his way back to the surface. "Now, Marcus!" I shouted. "Fight him now!" Marcus grabbed his own throat with both hands, as if he were choking himself. But I could see what he was really doing. He was trying to stop Morrison from speaking, from calling on whatever dark powers had kept him alive for 2 centuries. The white flames spread across the cave floor, consuming the supernatural moonshine and everything it touched. The phantom sounds of battle grew louder, and for a moment I could see them, ghostly figures in Revolutionary War uniforms, both British and American, fighting an eternal battle that had been trapped in this cave for over 200 years. And there was Morrison himself, separate from Marcus now, a tall, grim-faced officer in a red coat, his chest torn open by what must have been the wound that killed him. He looked at me with eyes full of hatred and loss. "This isn't over, rebel," he snarled. "I'll find another way. I'll always find another way." But the white flames were consuming him, pulling him back toward whatever afterlife he'd been avoiding. The other ghosts, the Cherokee spirits that had blessed the sacred water, the American settlers who'd died defending their homes, maybe even some British soldiers who were ready to finally lay down their arms. They surrounded Morrison and dragged him into the light. His scream echoed through the cave one final time, and then there was silence. Marcus collapsed to his knees himself again, but shattered by the experience. The barrel was nothing but charred wood and twisted metal bands. The supernatural moonshine was gone, consumed by sacred fire. But I could still feel something in the cave, a presence, watching, waiting. We sealed Copper Creek Cave 3 days later, using the official story that geological instability made it unsafe for public access. The ATF report listed the incident as toxic chemical contamination from an illegal methanol operation, which explained why people had been acting strangely and why one of the suspects had been found in a catatonic state. Marcus recovered mostly. Physically, he was fine after a few days in the hospital. Mentally, well, that took longer. He'd experienced things no human mind was meant to handle. He'd been possessed by a spirit from the Revolutionary War, forced to watch helplessly as his body was used by a vengeful ghost. That kind of trauma doesn't just go away. But he was one of the lucky ones. Jimmy Watson spent 6 months in a psychiatric facility before the last traces of Morrison's possession finally faded. Bobby Lee Carver turned up 2 weeks later in a barn outside Lexington, speaking in the same 18th century accent and claiming to be a British loyalist. Ezra Whitman was never found. The government classified the whole incident under some kind of chemical weapons testing cover story. Men in suits came and asked me questions I couldn't answer, made me sign papers I didn't read, and strongly suggested that I forget everything I'd seen in that cave. But you don't forget something like that. You don't forget watching your partner or get possessed by a dead British officer. You don't forget sacred water turning evil moonshine into cleansing fire. And you don't forget the feeling that something is still out there, waiting. I transferred to the Cultural Preservation Division 6 months later. Now I work with local tribes and historical societies to protect sacred sites and preserve traditional knowledge. It's quieter work, and after what happened at Copper Creek, I appreciate quiet. Marcus became some kind of specialist in unusual cases involving traditional communities. The ATF doesn't advertise this, but they have a small team that handles incidents where normal law enforcement isn't enough. Marcus leads that team now. We don't talk much, but sometimes he sends me a postcard from whatever strange place his work has taken him. Usually just a single sentence, all quiet here, or nothing to report. But I know what he's really telling me. He's keeping watch, just like I am. Old Caleb Whitaker, the moonshiner who tried to warn us, became the unofficial guardian of the sealed cave. His family's been making legitimate whiskey for 3 generations now, but Caleb spends his time making sure nobody tries to reopen Copper Creek Cave. He's got cameras hidden in the trees and motion sensors on the trails. The Forest Service pays him a consulting fee and pretends it's for wildlife monitoring. But sometimes, late at night when the moon is dark and the wind is blowing through the limestone cliffs, People say they can still smell that sweet, rotten scent drifting out of the sealed cave. Still hear the sounds of phantom stills running in chambers that no longer exist. Still catch glimpses of figures in Revolutionary War uniforms walking the old trails. Maybe it's just imagination. Maybe sealing the cave was enough. Maybe Morrison and his supernatural moonshine operation are gone for good. I hope so, but I've learned something important in my years as a forest ranger. Some family traditions exist to protect us from things law enforcement was never trained to handle. The old Cherokee woman who sold me the sacred water, she knew. Caleb Whitaker and his moonshine wisdom, he knew. Even my great-grandfather, the preacher who got killed by federal agents who thought he was hiding a still, maybe he knew too. There are places in these mountains that are older than our laws, older than our governments, older than our understanding. Places where the normal rules don't apply. Places where the dead don't always stay buried, and the past doesn't always stay in the past. Most of the time, we can pretend those places don't exist. We can seal them up and classify the reports and transfer the witnesses to other departments. We can call it chemical contamination or gang violence or mass hysteria. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm patrolling the back trails of Daniel Boone National Forest, I remember Captain Morrison's last words, "I'll always find another way." And I keep my radio close, my service weapon loaded, and a bottle of sacred water in my backpack, just in case. Because in these mountains, you never know what might be waiting in the next cave, or what kind of bargain someone might try to make with powers that should be left alone. My name is Rebecca Moonshiner, and I've learned that some family names carry their own kind of protection. Even the ones that seem like jokes. Especially the ones that seem like jokes. My name is Joseph Blackthorne, and I wish I'd never heard of Dead Man's Hollow. I've been a park ranger for 8 years now, working the remote parts of Shenandoah National Park in Virginia. My grandfather used to say I had mountain blood in my veins, and he was right. 3 generations of Blackthorns have called these Blue Ridge Mountains home. I know every trail, every cave, every hidden creek in a 50-mile circle. That October in 1987, the mountains felt wrong. It started with the weather. We'd had weeks of weird heat for October, then suddenly the temperature dropped 30 degrees overnight. Thick fog rolled into the valleys and just sat there for days, like something was holding it in place. The Cherokee who lived here before us called Dead Man's Hollow where spirits feed. I always figured that was just old stories. I should have listened to the old stories. "Joe, we've got another missing persons report." Maria Santos walked into the ranger station that morning, shaking her head. She was my partner, 15 years on the job, and she didn't scare easy, but I could see worry in her dark eyes. "That makes 8 people in a month," she said, dropping the file on my desk. "All last seen heading into Dead Man's Hollow." I picked up the report. The Hendricks family from Richmond. Mom, Dad, 2 teenage kids. Just like the others, experienced hikers with good gear. The kind of people who don't just disappear. "Could be bears," I said. But I didn't believe it. Bears don't take whole families without leaving blood or torn clothes behind. In this weather, they should be getting ready to sleep for winter. Maria sat down hard in her chair. "Joe, I've been doing this job since before you got out of high school. I've never seen anything like this." I checked our equipment one more time. CB radios, basic GPS units, rope rescue gear, first aid supplies, standard 1987 RAN, GEAR equipment. It felt like taking a water gun to fight a forest fire. The drive to Dead Man's Hollow took 45 minutes on winding mountain roads. The fog got thicker as we went deeper into the valley. Our headlights barely cut through the gray soup. When we finally parked at the trailhead, the silence hit me like a physical thing. No bird songs, no insect buzz. Even the wind seemed muffled. "You hear that?" Maria whispered. "I don't hear anything, that's the problem." We followed Hollow Creek Trail into the valley. The fog made everything look like a dream or a nightmare. Trees appeared and disappeared like ghosts. Our footsteps echoed strangely, like we were walking through a tunnel instead of open forest. After 20 minutes of hiking, we found the first campsite. 2 tents sat perfectly arranged next to the creek. The fire ring still had warm ashes. Sleeping bags were laid out neat and tidy. Food hung properly in bear bags. Coffee cups sat half full on the picnic table, but no people. "Looks like they just stepped away for a minute," Maria said, but her voice was tight. I knelt down to examine the ground around the tents. That's when I saw them. Holes in the earth, perfectly round, about 3 feet deep. They were arranged in a pattern around the campsite like points on a star. I'd never seen anything like them. "Maria, come look at this." She crouched beside me and peered into one of the holes. "These look machine-made. But what kind of machine makes holes like this?" I stuck my hand into the nearest hole. The dirt was warm. Not sun-warm. This was October, and we hadn't seen sun in days. This was warm like body heat. "They go deep," I said, pulling my hand back, "real deep." That's when our CB radio crackled to life. "Company B, fall back to the ridgeline. They're coming up from the ground." The voice was full of panic and static. Maria grabbed the rad. "EO. This is Park Service. Identify yourself." Silence for a long moment. Then, "Johnny, help me. They got Johnny. Oh God. They pulled him down." The transmission cut to static. Maria and I looked at each other. The voice sounded wrong somehow, old-fashioned, like someone from a black-and-white movie. "Could be someone playing pranks," she said, but I could tell she didn't believe it. I was about to answer when I felt it, a vibration through the soles of my boots, a rhythmic thumping from somewhere deep underground, like a massive heartbeat. The fog seemed to thicken around us. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees. "We need to call this in," Maria said. I tried the CB radio, nothing but static. Our GPS units showed error messages. We were on our own. The vibrations got stronger as we moved deeper into the campsite. I knelt down and pressed my ear to the ground. The thumping was definitely coming from below, slow, steady, like something huge was breathing down there. "Joe, look at this." Maria was standing beside the creek, pointing at something in the water. A piece of fabric caught on the rocks. I waded in and pulled it free. A child's jacket, torn and muddy. "This belongs to the Hendricks daughter," I said, checking the tag. "Sarah, age 13. But there was something else. The jacket was covered in a strange white substance that looked like chalk dust. It came off on my fingers and left them feeling numb. "We need to follow the creek downstream," I said, "see if we can find more signs." The creek bed was the only clear path through the fog. As we walked, I noticed the rocks were arranged in weird patterns, not natural, like someone had been moving them around. Every few yards, we found more of those perfectly round holes in the banks. After about 200 yards, Maria grabbed my arm. "There," she whispered, pointing through the fog. Something was sticking up from the ground ahead of us. As we got closer, I realized what it was. A person's head. The rest of the body was buried upright in the soft earth beside the creek. It was a man, in his 40s, wearing a hiking jacket. His eyes were gone, just empty sockets. But the worst part was his face, frozen in a silent scream, mouth wide open like he'd been trying to yell for help. "That's David Hendricks," Maria said, checking her missing persons file. "The father." I knelt beside the body. The earth around him was packed tight, like it had been pressed down by enormous pressure. But there were no tool marks, no sign that anyone had dug a grave. It was like the ground had just swallowed him up to his neck and then squeezed. "How is this possible?" Maria whispered. Before I could answer, the CB radio crackled again. "Fall back! Fall back! The dead won't stay buried." This time the voice was clearer. It sounded like a young man, maybe 20 years old, with a thick Virginia accent. "They're coming up through the ground! The whole Confederate line is—" Static drowned out the rest. "Confederate line?" Maria looked confused. "Joe, what year did you say this was?" 1987, I said. But something was tickling the back of my mind. A memory of my grandfather telling stories by the fire on winter nights. Grandpa used to talk about the Civil War battle that happened here, I said slowly. 1862. Union soldiers got trapped in this valley. Confederates surrounded them, and it was a massacre. 200 men died. The fog seemed to press closer around us. The temperature dropped again, and I could see our breath now. That was over 100 years ago, Maria said. Yeah, but Grandpa always said some places hold on to their pain. Said the ground here was soaked with so much blood and fear that it never forgot. Another vibration shook the earth under our feet. This time it lasted longer, and I heard something else. A sound like scratching, like fingernails clawing at wood. It was coming from below. We need to get back to the truck, Maria said. But as we turned to Amtonseus round, I realized we had a problem. The fog had gotten so thick we couldn't see more than 10 feet in any direction. And the creek, which we'd been following as our guide, had somehow disappeared. Which way? I asked. Maria spun around, trying to get her bearings. I don't know. Everything looks the same. That's when we heard the screaming. It was coming from somewhere ahead of us in the fog, a woman's voice, high and terrified, then a child crying, then a man shouting for help. The Hendricks family, Maria breathed. We ran toward the sounds, crashing through bushes and stumbling over rocks. The voices seemed to come from all directions at once, echoing strangely in the thick air. Every time we thought we were getting close, the screaming would start up somewhere else. After running for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, we burst into a small clearing. In the center was another one of those round holes, but this one was bigger, maybe 6 feet across, and it was glowing with a soft, sickly light. The screaming was coming from inside the hole. I dropped to my hands and knees and crawled to the edge. The hole went down at least 20 feet before curving out of sight. The walls were smooth, like they'd been carved by some kind of machine, but no machine I knew of could work with that kind of precision. "Hello?" I called down. "Can anyone hear me?" The screaming stopped instantly. Then, after a long pause, a voice drifted up from the depths. "Help us," it whispered. "It's so cold down here. It won't let us die." The voice sounded like Sarah Hendricks, the 13-year-old girl, but there was something wrong with it, like she was talking through water. "Sarah, is that you? This is Park Ranger Blackthorn. Can you climb up?" "We can't move," the voice said. "It has us. It's growing into us." "What has you, Sarah? What's down there?" But instead of an answer, I heard something else, a low rumbling from deep in the hole. The sickly light got brighter, and I could smell something awful drifting up, like meat that had been left out in the sun for weeks. "Joe, we need to go, now." Maria was backing away from the hole. That's when the ground started to shake. The shaking got worse, and I heard a sound like tree roots cracking. All around the clearing, more holes were opening up in the ground. The sickly light was coming from all of them now, turning the fog into a green nightmare. "Run!" I yelled, but Maria was already moving. We crashed through the forest, jumping over fallen logs and dodging trees that appeared suddenly out of the fog. Behind us, I could hear something big moving through the earth, following us. The ground shook with each movement. Our CB radio came alive again, voices overlapping in panic. "They're in the trees! God help us! They're coming out of the ground! Sergeant, the whole line is breaking! Mama, I want to go home!" The voices were from different time periods. Some sounded modern, others like they were from more than a century ago. All of them were terrified. We broke through some thick brush and found ourselves back at the creek. But now I could see things in the water that hadn't been there before. Pieces of old uniforms floating in the current, a musket barrel sticking up from the mud, and bones, lots of bones, white in the strange light coming up from the holes in the creek bed. "This is the battlefield," I said, understanding finally hitting me. "We're standing right on top of where those soldiers died." Maria was trying to get our GPS to work, but the screen kept showing error messages. "Joe, which way is the truck?" Before I could answer, something grabbed my ankle. I looked down and saw a hand sticking up from the soft earth beside the creek. pale, skeletal fingers wrapped around my boot. As I watched in horror, an arm followed, then a shoulder. A Confederate soldier was pulling himself up out of the ground. His uniform was rotted and muddy, hanging in strips from his bones. His face was mostly gone, just empty eye sockets and teeth. But somehow he was moving, clawing his way up from whatever grave he'd been lying in for 125 years. Kicked free and stumbled backward, but more hands were breaking through the earth all around us. Union soldiers in blue, Confederates in gray, all of them pulling themselves up from the mud with movements that were too slow and too wrong. "They can't be real," Maria whispered. But real or not, they were surrounding us. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, rising from the battlefield like a nightmare army. They moved with purpose, forming lines just like they probably had during the battle, and all of them were looking at us with those empty sockets. That's when I saw her. Maria was standing at the edge of the creek, but something was wrong. Her feet were sinking into the mud, and she couldn't pull them free. The earth was holding her like quicksand. "Joe!" she screamed, reaching for me. "Help me!" I grabbed her hands and pulled, but it was like trying to lift a car. Whatever was in the ground had her, and it was strong. She sank up to her knees, then her waist. "It's alive!" she gasped. "The whole valley is alive, and it's hungry!" The ghostly soldiers were getting closer, but they weren't trying to hurt us. They were trying to warn us. I could see it in the way they moved, the way they pointed at the ground. They'd been trapped here for over a century, fighting the same battle over and over, and something was feeding on their pain. Maria sank up to her chest. I could see terror in her eyes, but also something else, like she was listening to something I couldn't hear. "It's speaking to me," she said. "It says it's been waiting so long for fresh meat. The soldiers aren't enough anymore. It wants the living." "What is it?" I shouted, still trying to pull her free. "It calls itself the Keeper. It says it keeps the dead fighting so it can feed on their fear and pain. But now it wants to add us to its collection." The mud was up to her shoulders now. In a few seconds, she'd be completely buried. That's when I remembered my grandfather's stories about dealing with earth spirits. He used to tell about the old Cherokee ways, how they would use salt and iron to bind things that shouldn't be walking around. I dumped out my backpack looking for anything that might help. Emergency flare, first aid kit, rope, camping supplies, salt packets from my lunch, iron tent stakes. It was a long shot, but it was all I had. "Hang on, Maria." I started arranging the iron stakes in a circle around us, just like my grandfather had described. The Cherokee pattern for binding earth spirits. The ghostly soldiers stopped advancing. Some of them started pointing at what I was doing, nodding their skeletal heads like they approved. I tore open the salt packets and poured them in lines between the stakes. As soon as the salt hit the ground, Maria stopped sinking. "It's working," she gasped. But our victory didn't last long. The ground around our salt circle started to crack and heave. Something huge was moving underneath us, and it was angry. The sickly green light got brighter, and I could hear a sound like screaming wind coming from the holes. Then the earth split open, and I saw what we were really dealing with. It wasn't just one creature. The Keeper was the entire valley, a massive thing made of earth and roots and the bones of everyone who'd ever died here. It had faces scattered across its surface, some ancient, some recent. I saw Sarah Hendrick's face among them, and her father's, all of them twisted in permanent agony. And right in the center, I saw Maria's face beginning to form. The Keeper spoke, and its voice came from everywhere at once, the trees, the rocks, the fog itself. "You cannot escape," it said in voices I recognized. Dead hikers, long-lost campers, and underneath it all, the voices of 200 Civil War soldiers. Feed me your fear, and join my collection. Our salt circle was all that stood between us and becoming part of this nightmare forever. The Keeper's massive form rose up around our salt circle like a living mountain. Faces pushed out from its surface. Some I recognized from the missing persons reports, others that looked like they'd been there much longer. All of them were screaming silently, their mouths open but no sound coming out. Maria was still trapped up to her shoulders, but at least she wasn't sinking anymore. The salt circle was holding, but I could see cracks starting to form where the creature was testing our defenses. Joe, Maria said, her voice strange and distant. It's in my head. I can hear all of them. Every person it's ever taken. They're all still conscious, still aware. It feeds on their terror for years before they finally give up and become part of it. The ghostly Civil War soldiers were still surrounding us, but now I could see they were trying to help. They were pointing at something behind the creature, a dark opening in the valley wall that I hadn't noticed before. The cave, one of them whispered, his voice like wind through dry leaves. End it there. And what? I called out. The source, the ghost soldier said. The thing that makes the earth hungry. Destroy it and we can finally rest. The keeper heard this and roared with a sound like an earthquake. It pressed closer to our circle, and I could see the salt beginning to dissolve under the pressure. Maria, I need you to listen to me, I said. Can you still move your arms? She nodded, though it looked like it took all her strength. In my pack there's emergency explosives. Cave-in charges for rescue operations. Can you reach them? She stretched out her hand and managed to grab the pack. Inside were 3 small charges designed to clear rock slides. Not much, but they might be enough to collapse whatever was in that cave. I have them, she said. But Joe, I can't feel my legs anymore. I think it's starting to absorb me. I looked down and saw she was right. Where the mud covered her body, her skin was turning gray and hard, like it was becoming part of the earth itself. You have to go without me, she said. End this thing before it spreads beyond the valley. I'm not leaving you. You don't have a choice. Her voice was getting fainter, and I could see more of her face was turning gray. It's taking me, no matter what. But you can still save everyone else. The salt circle cracked wider. The keeper pressed closer, and I could smell its breath, the stench of 100 years of death and decay. Go! Maria shouted, and with her last bit of human strength, she threw the explosives toward the cave opening. I caught them and ran. The keeper tried to grab me as I left the circle, massive hands made of earth and bone reaching out from all directions. But the ghostly soldiers got in its way, throwing themselves between me and the creature. For the first time in 125 years, Union and Confederate troops were fighting on the same side. I ran toward the cave as the battle raged behind me. The ground shook with each step, and I could hear Maria screaming as the keeper finally claimed her. But, mixed in with her voice, I heard something else. She was telling me how to set the charges. Load-bearing walls, her voice echoed. Find the natural supports. The cave mouth was hidden behind a curtain of fog and hanging vines. As I pushed through, I could see why the keeper didn't want me to reach it. The cave wasn't natural. It was carved, with symbols covering the walls that hurt to look at. And in the center, sitting on a stone altar, was the source of all the evil in Dead Man's Hollow. It looked like a heart made of black stone, but it was beating like it was alive. With each pulse, I could feel the keeper's power growing stronger. Veins of that sickly green light spread out from the altar into the rock walls, probably extending throughout the entire valley. This was what was feeding the creature, keeping it alive and hungry after all these years. I started placing the charges around the cave's support pillars, just like Maria had taught me. During our rescue training, 3 small explosives, but if I placed them right, they should bring down the whole cavern. As I worked, I could hear voices coming from the stone heart. All the people the keeper had taken over the decades. They were begging me to hurry, to end their suffering. Please, I heard Sarah Hendricks whisper. It hurts so much. Make it stop. I set the timer for 30 seconds and ran. Behind me, the keeper had won its battle with the ghostly soldiers. They were fading away, their energy spent. The creature filled the cave entrance like a wave of living earth, reaching for me with 100 grasping hands. You cannot destroy me, it roared. I am eternal. I am the pain of this place. 20 seconds. I ran through the forest as tree branches grabbed at me like fingers. The fog was so thick I could barely see, but somehow I knew which way to go. Maybe the ghostly soldiers were still helping, or maybe desperation gave me some kind of supernatural sense. 10 seconds. The keeper's voice was right behind me, speaking in Maria's words. Joe, don't leave me here. Come back. Help me. But I knew it wasn't really her. Maria was gone, and the only way to honor her sacrifice was to finish what we'd started. 5 seconds. I dove behind a fallen log just as the explosives went off. The sound was like the world ending, a crack of thunder that went on, followed by the rumble of tons of rock collapsing. The ground shook so hard it threw me into the air, and I heard the keeper's death scream echo across 3 counties. Then, suddenly, silence. When I woke up, the fog was gone. Sunlight streamed down through the trees for the first time in days. Birds were singing. Somewhere in the distance I could hear a creek babbling over rocks, normal sounds, living sounds. I was lying next to the fallen log, covered in dirt and leaves. My body ached like I'd been hit by a truck, but I was alive. Behind me, where the cave entrance had been, there was now a huge pile of rubble. The explosion had brought down the entire hillside. And the keeper was gone. I could feel it. The oppressive weight that had been pressing down on the valley for over a century had finally lifted. The hungry presence was dead. But so was Maria. I found her body near the creek, where the salt circle had been. The earth had released her when the creature died, but it was too late. She looked peaceful, though, like she was just sleeping. That was something, at least. It took me 3 hours to hike out of the valley to where we'd left the truck. My radio started working again as soon as I got to higher ground. "This is Ranger Blackthorn requesting immediate backup and medical assistance," I called in. "Officer down in Dead Man's Hollow, multiple casualties." The response was quick and professional. Within an hour, the valley was full of emergency vehicles, federal agents, and medical personnel. They found the bodies of the missing hikers scattered throughout the area, all of them showing signs of having been buried alive. The official cause of death was listed as geological instability, a cave-in that had trapped the victims underground. That was the story the government went with. Geological instability, a tragic accident that claimed the life of a veteran park ranger and 8 innocent civilians. The area was immediately closed to the public and designated as a geological hazard zone. The federal team that studied the site found nothing unusual according to their official report, just unstable limestone formations that had suddenly collapsed. They recommended the area remain closed permanently for public safety. I spent 3 days in the hospital being treated for hypothermia and stress-related hallucinations. The psychiatrist was very understanding. He explained that traumatic events can cause people to experience things that aren't really there, the mind's way of dealing with loss and fear. I didn't argue with him. What would be the point? But I know what really happened in Dead Man's Hollow. And sometimes, late at night when the world is quiet, I can still hear Maria calling my name from somewhere deep underground. They transferred me to an urban park assignment after I got out of the hospital, said I needed to be around people for a while, away from the isolation of the mountains. It was probably a good idea. I don't think I could handle the deep woods anymore, knowing what kinds of things might be sleeping beneath the earth. I still drive by Dead Man's Hollow sometimes, even though it's officially off-limits. The access road is blocked by concrete barriers and warning signs are posted every few yards. But on quiet October nights, when the fog rolls in thick, locals report hearing the sound of Civil War battles echoing from the sealed valley. Musket fire and cannon blasts, men screaming orders, the clash of bayonets. But these days, the sounds don't last very long, and people say that if you listen carefully, you can hear something else mixed in with the battle noises. The sound of soldiers finally laying down their weapons and walking away into peaceful silence. The Cherokee elder, Mary Crow Feather, performed a blessing ceremony over the site a month after the incident. She said the hungry earth was finally sleeping and the spirits of the dead could rest. She also told me that some places hold on to pain so deep it becomes alive, but that sometimes, if you're brave enough, you can help them let it go. I think about that a lot these days. I think about Maria, and about how her sacrifice saved who knows how many other people from becoming part of the Keeper's collection. I think about those Civil War soldiers and how they spent 125 years trapped in an endless battle until someone finally gave them permission to stop fighting. And I think about the warning my grandfather tried to give me all Those years ago when he told stories about things that live beneath the mountains. Maybe the old stories are more than just superstition. Maybe they're warnings passed down from people who learned the hard way that some places are better left alone. Dead Man's Hollow earned its name, and now everyone knows why. The concrete barriers are still there, and the warning signs still tell people to stay away. But sometimes I wonder if that's enough. Because late at night, when I'm trying to sleep in my apartment 50 miles away from those mountains, I can still feel something stirring deep in the earth, waiting, listening, growing hungry again. My name is Nathaniel Crowfoot, and I wish I'd never heard of Hunger Hollow. I've been a park ranger for 7 years now, working the Cherokee National Forest in Tennessee. Most people think my job is all campfire talks and helping lost hikers, but the truth is darker than that. We see things in these woods that never make it into our reports, things that would make people stop visiting if they knew. I'm half Cherokee on my mother's side. My grandmother raised me after my parents died in a car wreck when I was 12. She taught me the old ways alongside the new. How to track a deer by broken twigs, how to find water when you're lost, how to read the forest's moods. She also taught me things the Ranger Academy never covered. Things about spirits and hungry shadows that most people would laugh at. Until they met one. It was September 1985 and hunting season was in full swing. The leaves were just starting to turn, painting the ridges in gold and crimson. Perfect weather for deer hunting, which meant perfect weather for people to get themselves into trouble. That's when my supervisor paired me up with Bill Patterson for what should have been a routine investigation. Bill was a good ranger, don't get me wrong. 20 years on the job, military background, knew these woods like his own backyard. But he was the kind of man who believed only in things he could see, touch, and arrest. He'd roll his eyes whenever I mentioned something my grandmother taught me. "Crowfoot," he said that first morning as we loaded our gear. "We got 5 hunters missing in Hunger Hollow. Probably just got turned around or decided to extend their trips without telling anyone. Standard search and rescue." Hunger Hollow. Even the name made my skin crawl. It was a 5-mile valley carved deep between 2 ridges, accessible only by one narrow trail. Great hunting, everyone said. The deer practically walked up to your gun. Local hunters had been going there for decades. What Bill didn't know, what I'd never told him, was that my grandmother had warned me about that place since I was old enough to walk. "That valley remembers hunger," she'd said in Cherokee, her old hands shaking as she pointed toward the hollow from our front porch. In the winter of 1838, our people were forced through there during the removal. Snow came early, food ran out. She'd never finished that sentence, but I understood. Sometimes understanding comes through your blood, not your ears. We hiked into the hollow that Tuesday morning, our breath making clouds in the unusually cold air. September in Tennessee shouldn't feel like November, but the temperature had dropped 20 degrees overnight. Our CB radios crackled with static, and my compass kept drifting east no matter which way I pointed it. "Equipment's acting up," I told Bill. He checked his own compass and frowned. "Probably iron deposits in the rocks. Nothing to worry about." The first camp we found was 3 miles in. It belonged to the Morrison brothers from Knoxville, experienced hunters who'd been coming here for 15 years. Their tent was still standing, sleeping bags still laid out. But their campfire had cold ashes, and when I looked closer, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Their dinner was still on their plates, beans and hot dogs, barely touched. Steam would have stopped rising hours ago, but the food wasn't moldy or dried out. It looked like they'd just stood up and walked away mid-bite. "That's odd," Bill said, poking at the cold food with a stick. "Nobody leaves good food behind in the woods." I found their rifles leaning against a tree, fully loaded. Hunters don't abandon loaded weapons. Ever. Especially not experienced ones like the Morrisons. But it was the tracks that really scared me. Leading. Away from the camp, I found boot prints in the soft earth. Size 10 hiking boots, the kind the Morrison brothers wore. The prints headed deeper into the hollow, toward the place my grandmother had warned me never to go. But as I followed them, something changed. The boot prints started to stretch out, like whoever was wearing them had begun taking longer and longer steps. Then the heel marks disappeared, leaving only the toe impressions. Then even those changed, becoming longer, with what looked like claw marks extending from where the toes should have been. I called Bill over, but by the time he arrived, clouds had covered the sun and the light was all wrong. The tracks looked like normal boot prints again. "See," Bill said. "Just soft ground playing tricks on your eyes." That's when the wind shifted, and I smelled something that made my grandmother's warnings echo in my memory. It was the smell she'd taught me to recognize, rotting meat mixed with pine needles and something else. Something like fear itself had a scent. I never believed my grandmother's Wendigo stories until I smelled that stench in those woods. We set up our own camp a half-mile from the Morrison site and spent the afternoon searching for more clues. The deeper we went into the hollow, the more wrong everything felt. Birds didn't sing here. Squirrels didn't chatter. Even the wind seemed muffled, like the forest was holding its breath. By evening, we'd found 2 more abandoned camps. Same story. Food left half-eaten, gear scattered but not stolen, weapons left behind. Each time I found those strange tracks leading deeper into the hollow, and each time Bill found a logical explanation. "Bears," he said. "Big one, probably sick or injured. That's why it's not afraid of humans." But I knew it wasn't a bear. Bears don't arrange human bones in patterns. I found the first body just after sunset. We'd been following our CB radio's crackling static, thinking maybe we could pick up transmissions from the missing hunters. Instead, the static led us to a small clearing where someone had built a fire pit out of stacked stones. The fire was long dead, but the smell of smoke still hung in the air. Jimmy Morrison was sitting with his back against an oak tree, looking like he was resting, until you got close enough to see that his chest had been torn open and his ribs spread wide like wings. The bones were white and clean, picked completely bare. His skull had been cracked like a walnut, the inside scooped out. But the worst part wasn't what had been done to him. It was how his body had been arranged. I recognized the position from my grandmother's stories, the way Cherokee people used to bury their dead during starvation times so the spirits could find food in the next world. Someone or something had arranged Jimmy Morrison in the traditional Cherokee starvation burial position. Bill threw up behind a tree. I just stood there, shaking, as my grandmother's voice echoed in my memory. When people starve in a sacred place, sometimes the hunger doesn't die with them. Sometimes it grows. "Jesus Christ," Bill gasped, wiping his mouth. "What kind of animal does that?" I wanted to tell him. I wanted to explain about the Wendigo, the hunger spirit that my grandmother said was born from starvation and cannibalism. But Bill wouldn't have believed me. Not yet. "We need to radio for backup," I said. Bill tried his radio, but all we got was static. Then, clear as day, we heard a voice come through the speaker. "Help me," it said in Jimmy Morrison's voice. "I'm lost. Please help me." Bill grabbed the radio. "Jimmy? Jimmy Morrison? Where are you?" "I'm so hungry," the voice replied. "So very hungry. Please come find me." The transmission cut to static. We stared at each other in the dying light, both of us thinking the same thing. We'd just found Jimmy Morrison's body, picked clean and arranged like an offering to hungry spirits. So who was calling for help on his radio? That night, we took turns standing watch. Bill insisted on first shift, his service pistol in his lap and a powerful flashlight sweeping the tree line every few seconds. I tried to sleep, but kept hearing sounds just beyond our fire's glow, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, and something that might have been breathing. Around midnight, Bill shook me awake. "Listen," he whispered. From somewhere deep in the hollow came a sound like nothing I'd ever heard. It started as a howl, long and mournful like a wolf calling to its pack. But as it continued, I began to hear human words buried in the sound. Cherokee words that made my blood freeze. Gitski, Gitski, Ganita, hungry, hungry, starving. Bill heard it too, his face pale in the firelight. "That's not natural," he said. "No," I agreed. "It's not." The howling continued for an hour, moving around our camp like something was circling us, staying just out of sight. Every time Bill pointed his flashlight toward the sound, it would stop for a moment, then start up again somewhere else. When dawn finally came, we found tracks around our campsite. Not boot prints this time, but something that looked almost human. Almost. The feet were too long, the toes ended in claws, and the stride was longer than any human could manage. Bill stared at the tracks for a long time, his rational mind struggling with what his eyes were telling him. "We're dealing with something dangerous here," he finally said. I wanted to tell him just how dangerous, but I knew he wasn't ready to hear it. Not yet. We found Bill's body 3 days later. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you what happened in between, because understanding how Bill died is important to understanding what we were dealing with in Hunger Hollow. After finding Jimmy Morrison's remains, we hiked back to headquarters to report our findings and get backup. The sheriff's department sent a team to recover the body, but by the time they reached the clearing, it was gone. No trace of Jimmy Morrison. No blood. No bones. Just disturbed earth and that sick, sweet smell of rotting meat. Bill was shaken, but determined to find a logical explanation. "Animals must have scattered the remains," he said. "Probably that same bear that killed him." I didn't argue, but I knew better. Nothing natural removes all trace of a human body in 6 hours. We returned with a full search team, 6 rangers, 2 sheriff's deputies, and a tracking dog named Rex, who'd found dozens of missing people over the years. Rex was a good dog, trained to follow human scent trails that were days old. But when we reached Hunger Hollow, Rex went crazy. He whined and pulled at his leash, trying to get away from the valley. When his handler forced him forward, the dog started howling and wouldn't stop until we took him back to the vehicles. "Never seen him act like that," his handler said. "It's like he can smell something that terrifies him." I knew what Rex was smelling, the same thing I'd been smelling since we first entered the hollow, the scent of something that shouldn't exist but did anyway. We split into 3 teams to cover more ground. Bill and I took the deepest part of the valley, where the missing hunters were most likely to have gone. The other teams would work their way in from the sides. That's when we found the feeding ground. In a grove of ancient oaks, someone had stripped the bark from dozens of trees in ritualistic patterns. The exposed wood was carved with symbols that made my skin crawl when I looked at them. I recognized some from my grandmother's stories, Cherokee symbols meaning hunger, feast, and feeding ground. But these symbols were wrong somehow, twisted into shapes that hurt to look at, like someone had taken sacred words and corrupted them into something evil. "What kind of sicko does this?" Bill muttered, running his fingers over the carved symbols. Before I could answer, we heard screaming from the direction of Team 2. We ran toward the sound, crashing through underbrush and jumping over fallen logs. The screaming cut off abruptly, replaced by a silence that was somehow worse. When we reached Team 2's last known position, we found 2 empty backpacks and a puddle of blood that was still warm. No bodies, no drag marks, just blood and the lingering smell of fear. Bill tried to radio the 3rd team, but all he got was static. Then, clearly through the interference, we heard Deputy Martinez's voice. "Help us," he said. "It's got Jenkins. Oh God, the way it moves. It's not human. It's not—" The transmission ended in screaming. That's when Bill finally started to believe. "What is it?" he asked me, his voice shaking. "What's out there?" I told him everything. About the Wendigo, the hunger spirit that's born from cannibalism and starvation. About what happened to the Cherokee people in this valley during the winter of 1838, forced to eat their dead to survive. About how some hungers never die, they just wait for the right conditions to wake up again. Bill listened without interrupting, his face growing paler with each word. "So how do we stop it?" he asked. "I don't know," I admitted. My grandmother never told me that part. We made it back to the vehicles as the sun was setting, only to find them destroyed. Tires slashed, engines torn apart, radio equipment scattered across the ground like someone had been looking for something inside the metal and wires. We were stranded in the hollow with something that had already killed at least 7 people. That night, we built our fire in a ring of the old oak trees, hoping the Cherokee symbols carved into the bark might offer some protection. Bill sat with his back to mine, both of us facing outward with our weapons ready. Around midnight, we started hearing voices. "Bill," called Deputy Martinez from the darkness. "Bill, where are you? I'm hurt bad. Need help." Bill started to stand, but I grabbed his arm. "Martinez is dead," I whispered. "We both heard him die on the radio." "Bill!" The voice was closer now, more urgent. "Please, I can't find my way back. It's so dark and I'm bleeding." "That's not Martinez," I said. "It's trying to lure you away." But the voice sounded so real, so desperate. It was hard not to respond, hard not to try to help. Then we heard my father's voice calling from the trees. "Nathaniel," he said in Cherokee, "come to me, son. I've been waiting so long." My father had been dead for 17 years. The thing in the woods called to us all night, using the voices of people we'd known, people we'd cared about, people we'd failed to save. It knew exactly what to say to make us want to leave the safety of our fire. But we didn't leave. We sat back to back until dawn, listening to the hungry dead call our names. When the sun came up, Bill was gone. I found what was left of Bill arranged in the same position as Jimmy Morrison had been, his body placed against an oak tree like he was resting. But there was less of him than there had been of Jimmy. Whatever was killing them was getting hungrier, taking more with each feeding. Above his body, carved fresh into the oak's bark, were new symbols, Cherokee words that roughly translated to, "The hunger grows. Soon there will be enough." I was alone in Hunger Hollow, with a Wendigo. That's when I decided to visit my grandmother. It took me 2 days to hike out of the hollow and get to her house on the reservation. She was waiting for me on her front porch, rocking in her old chair like she'd known I was coming. "Grandmother," I said in Cherokee, "the hunger shadow has awakened." She nodded slowly. I felt it stirring. The dead who starved in that place have been restless for many weeks. "Tell me what you've seen." I told her everything. The missing hunters, the bodies arranged in traditional burial positions, the voices calling from the darkness, Bill's death. She listened without interrupting, her old eyes growing sadder with each detail. You must go back," she said finally. "Go back? Grandmother, that thing has killed at least 8 people. I need to get help, bring the National Guard, something." "No." Her voice was firm. "White man's weapons cannot kill what white man's hunger created. Only Cherokee blood can end what Cherokee suffering began." She explained it to me then, the full story she'd never told when I was a child. In the winter of 1838, a band of Cherokee had taken shelter in the hollow during the forced removal. Snow blocked the passes, and their government escorts had abandoned them to die. For 3 months, they ate bark, roots, anything they could find. When that ran out, they ate their horses. When the horses were gone, they ate their dogs. And when the dogs were gone, my great-great-grandmother was there, she said. She told me the story before she died. Said some of the people went mad with hunger, started looking at each other with different eyes, started seeing meat instead of family. By spring, only 7 people walked out of that hollow. Everyone else had either died of starvation or been consumed by their own people's desperation. The survivors never spoke of what happened there, but the hunger remained. It soaked into the earth, into the trees, into the very stones of that place. And now it feeds again, my grandmother said, growing stronger with each kill. She taught me the ritual I would need, how to make the sacred fire, what songs to sing, how to call on the spirits of our ancestors for help. But most importantly, she taught me what the Wendigo really was. It is not just a monster, she said. It is the hunger of our people made flesh, the desperation of those who died in that place. To defeat it, you must be willing to understand that hunger, to feel it as they felt it. And if I can't? She was quiet for a long moment. Then it will add your hunger to its own and grow stronger still. I returned to Hunger Hollow at sunset, carrying the sacred tobacco and sage my grandmother had given me. I could feel the thing watching me as I hiked back to the grove of carved oaks. It was stronger now, more solid. I caught glimpses of it moving between the trees, a gaunt figure that walked upright like a man but moved with the fluid grace of something that had never been entirely human. In the center of the grove, I built my fire according to my grandmother's instructions: sacred tobacco, sage, and cedar wood arranged in the traditional pattern. As the flames grew, I began the calling song, inviting the spirits of my ancestors to witness what would happen here. That's when the Wendigo showed itself. It stood 8 feet tall, gaunt as a famine victim, but impossibly strong. Its skin was gray-white, like old bone, stretched tight over a frame that should have collapsed under its own weight. Yellow fangs filled a mouth too wide for any human face, and its eyes were holes in reality, dark spaces where light went to die. But the worst part was that I recognized it. Under the corruption and hunger, I could see traces of the Cherokee people who had died in this place. It wore their faces like masks, shifting between the features of the starved and desperate. "You are hungry," it said, and its voice was the whisper of wind through empty bones. "I can smell it. The hunger for justice, for understanding, for connection to your people's pain. Come to me, and I will feed that hunger forever." It was right. I was hungry. Hungry to understand the suffering of my ancestors. Hungry to make their pain mean something. Hungry to prove I was worthy of the blood that ran in my veins. But my grandmother had taught me the difference between spiritual hunger and physical hunger. One could be satisfied with understanding and service. The other could never be filled, no matter how much it consumed. "I am hungry," I admitted, raising my voice to carry over the crackling fire. "But not for what you offer." The Wendigo circled my fire, staying just outside the ring of light. "You feel it, don't you? The echo of their starvation. Your great-great-grandmother's desperation. The moment she looked at her own child and wondered how long the meat would last. It was trying to break me down, to make me understand the horror so completely that I would become part of it. And it was working. I could feel the weight of ancestral trauma, the crushing desperation of people forced to choose between death and damnation. But then I heard my grandmother's voice, carried on the wind. Understanding is not becoming. Honoring is not repeating. I began the purification song, words in Cherokee that called on the spirits of the starved to find peace. The Wendigo howled in rage, but it couldn't cross the sacred fire. Not yet. They suffered, I sang. They died. They made impossible choices in impossible times. But their pain does not have to live forever. With each verse of the song, the Wendigo grew more desperate. It began speaking in the voices of all its victims, Jimmy Morrison begging for help, Bill calling my name, the missing hunters asking why I hadn't saved them. But I kept singing until dawn touched the hollow, and the creature's howls faded into silence. The Wendigo burned in the sacred fire, its death scream echoing with the voices of everyone who had ever starved in that hollow. As the flames consumed it, I saw the spirits of the Cherokee who had died there, not as monsters, but as people who had suffered beyond human endurance. They looked at me with grateful eyes before fading into the morning light. The carved symbols on the oak trees cracked and fell away, leaving clean bark behind. The sick, sweet smell of corruption was replaced by the honest scent of pine and earth. For the first time since entering Hunger Hollow, I heard birds singing, but the cost was higher than I'd expected. When the rescue teams finally found me 3 days later, I'd lost 20 pounds and couldn't stop shaking. The official report called it exposure and dehydration, but I knew better. Confronting the Wendigo had forced me to experience the collective starvation of my ancestors, to understand their desperation so completely that my body had responded as if I was actually starving. The FBI classified the Hunger Hollow incident as a serial killing by a disturbed individual, and all evidence of the supernatural was quietly buried. Bill and the other victims were given heroes' funerals, and their families were told they had died protecting hikers from a dangerous criminal. I couldn't return to work as a ranger. Every time I entered the forest, I could smell the lingering traces of spiritual hunger in places where people had suffered. So I left the Park Service and became a cultural liaison between the Cherokee Nation and various federal agencies, My job is to make sure sacred sites are protected and that traditional knowledge is respected in land management decisions. But sometimes, late at night, I get calls from rangers in other forests. They describe the same symptoms I first noticed in Hunger Hollow: missing hikers, abandoned camps, and the smell of corruption in sacred places. I pack my grandmother's tobacco and sage, and I travel to places where old hungers are waking up. Because the thing about spiritual hunger is that it's contagious. One Wendigo can create others if it feeds long enough. And there are a lot of places in this country where people have starved, where desperation has soaked into the land and waited for the right conditions to wake up. The Cherokee Nation officially recognizes my work now, though they can't say publicly what I really do. There's a hidden memorial in Hunger Hollow for the people who died there in 1838, and I visit it every year on the anniversary of the removal. I leave tobacco and sage, and I sing the old songs that keep the dead at peace. Most nights I sleep fine, but sometimes I dream of yellow fangs and hollow eyes, and I wake up hungry in a woe that food can never satisfy. My grandmother says that's the price of what I do, carrying a little bit of the Wendigo's hunger so it can't reform and feed again. Hunger is more than physical, she reminds me whenever I visit her on the reservation. It's spiritual, and spiritual hunger can consume more than flesh. It can consume entire communities, entire ways of life, if we're not careful to keep it fed with the right things. I understand now what she means. I feed my spiritual hunger with service to my people, with protection of sacred sites, with keeping the old stories alive so that the suffering they describe doesn't repeat itself. Because the real horror isn't that monsters exist. The real horror is how easily people can become monsters when they're desperate enough, hungry enough, pushed far enough beyond human endurance. And in America, there are still a lot of hungry places where monsters sleep in the ground, waiting for the right conditions to wake up and feed again. My name is Nathaniel Crowfoot, and I hunt the things that hunger creates. Sometimes I wonder who's hunting me. My name is Elena Ashworth, and I study how people used to live in the old mountain towns. I work for the Smithsonian, which is like a big museum in Washington. People pay me to find the last folks living in forgotten places and write down their stories before they're gone forever. In August 1992, I drove my Jeep up a bumpy dirt road in North Carolina's Great Smoky Mountains. The trees grew so thick they blocked out most of the sun. My graduate student Tommy Rodriguez sat next to me complaining about the heat and the bugs. Tommy was from Chicago and thought mountain people were just backwards hillbillies with crazy stories. "Dr. Ashworth, why are we going to this particular place?" he asked, wiping sweat from his face. "Because there's an old man named Ezra Whitman who might be the last person who remembers Haven Ridge," I said, steering around a fallen branch. "That town died in 1952. 23 children got sick with diphtheria and died in 1 week. The families couldn't handle burying all their babies, so they just packed up and left." Tommy made a face. "Sounds depressing. What's so special about it?" I'd been wondering the same thing. The locals I'd talked to in town got quiet and strange when I mentioned Haven Ridge. They'd change the subject or suddenly remember they had somewhere else to be. One old woman at the gas station grabbed my arm and whispered, "Some places are better left alone, honey." We reached Ezra's cabin just as the sun started going down. It was a small wooden house with a tin roof, surrounded by a vegetable garden that looked well kept. Smoke came from the chimney, even though it was 90 degrees outside. Ezra Whitman was 78 years old with bright blue eyes and hands that shook when he poured us sweet tea. He'd agreed to talk to me, but he seemed nervous, like he was keeping a secret he didn't want to tell. "I've been living up here my whole life," he said, rocking back and forth in his chair. "My family was going to move away after the sickness took all them children, but I stayed. Someone had to." "Someone had to what?" I asked, pulling out my tape recorder. Ezra looked at the machine like it might bite him. "You really want to know about Haven Ridge?" "That's why I'm here." He was quiet for a long time, just rocking and thinking. Finally, he said, "The children never left, Miss Elena. They couldn't leave. They loved that place too much." Tommy rolled his eyes, but something cold ran down my spine. I'd heard hundreds of ghost stories in my work, but the way Ezra said it made my skin crawl. "What do you mean they never left?" I asked. "I mean they're still there, still playing in that old schoolhouse, still sleeping in their beds, still waiting for their mamas to come back and get them." Ezra's voice got quieter. "But their mamas ain't never coming back." That night, Tommy and I set up our tent in a clearing about a mile from the abandoned settlement. I'd brought all the equipment I could carry: tape recorders, cameras, notebooks, camping gear. We didn't have cell phones back then, and the nearest neighbor was 15 miles away. As I lay in my sleeping bag, I kept thinking about what Ezra had said. In all my years studying mountain culture, I'd learned that when old-timers talked about spirits and haints, there was usually some truth mixed in with the superstition. Maybe not ghosts exactly, but something real that people couldn't explain any other way. The woods were completely silent. No owls hooting, no crickets chirping, no rustling of small animals in the bushes. Just dead quiet, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I should have taken that as a warning. The next morning, Tommy and I hiked the last half mile to Haven Ridge. What we found looked like a place where time had stopped. Thus, there were about a dozen houses scattered around a central area with a church, a schoolhouse, and what used to be a general store. Some buildings had collapsed, but others looked like the families had just stepped out for a walk. Laundry still hung on a few clotheslines, though it was rotted and full of holes. A child's wooden wagon sat in one yard, covered in 40 years of leaves. "Creepy," Tommy said, taking pictures with his camera, "but definitely not haunted." I started with the schoolhouse because that's where Ezra said the children spent most of their time. The door was stuck, but Tommy helped me push it open. Inside, desks were still arranged in neat rows. A chalkboard hung on the front wall with faded writing I couldn't read. Children's drawings were tacked to the walls, their bright colors turned pale and strange. "Look at this," I called to Tommy. I'd found a class roster on the teacher's desk. 23 names were written in careful handwriting: Mary Catherine Whitman, age 7, Samuel Hayes, age 9, Little Beth Turner, age 4. The list went on and on. "These are the children who died," I whispered. That's when I heard it. Singing. It was faint, like it was coming from far away, but I could make out the melody of "Ring Around the Rosie." Children's voices, high and sweet, echoing through the empty building. "Tommy, do you hear that?" He looked up from examining a broken desk. "Hear what?" The singing got a little louder. I could count at least 5 or 6 different voices, maybe more. They sang the whole song, then started over again. "Ring around the rosy, pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down." "You really don't hear children singing?" Tommy stared at me like I was losing my mind. "Dr. Ashworth, there are no children here. There haven't been children here for 40 years. But I could hear them clear as day. The song ended, and then came the sound of laughter and running feet, like kids playing tag in the next room. I followed the sound to the back of the schoolhouse, where a door led to a small storage area. The room was immense, except for some old books and a broken chair. But on the dusty floor I saw something that made my blood run cold. Fresh footprints, small ones, like children would make. And they were everywhere, crisscrossing the floor in patterns that looked like a game of some kind. "Tommy, come look at this." He came over and saw the footprints. His face went white. "That's impossible. We're the first people here in decades." "Take a picture," I said. He raised his camera, but when he tried to take the shot, it wouldn't work. He pressed the button again and again, but nothing happened. The camera had worked fine 5 minutes ago. We left the schoolhouse and explored more of the settlement. In one house, I found a kitchen table set for dinner, with plates and forks laid out like a family was about to sit down and eat. The food was long gone, of course, but someone had put fresh wildflowers in a jar in the center of the table. The flowers looked like they'd been picked that morning. "Dr. Ashworth," Tommy called from the next room. "You need to see this." I found him standing in what used to be a child's bedroom. A small bed was neatly made with a faded quilt. Toys were arranged on shelves like someone had just finished playing with them and put them away. And on the pillow was a doll with yellow hair and a blue dress. The doll looked brand new. "This is getting weird," Tommy said. He sounded scared, which surprised me. Tommy usually made fun of anything he couldn't explain with science. We spent the rest of the day going through the settlement. In every house where children had lived, we found signs that someone had been there recently. Beds made up, toys arranged, even what looked like children's drawings that seemed too fresh and bright to be 40 years old. But it was the photographs that really got to us. When Tommy developed his film that evening back at our camp, every Sushatum, Ingle pictures showed things we hadn't seen when we were taking them. Extra shadows in windows that looked like small figures, faces peering around corners. In one shot of the church, you could see what looked like a little girl sitting in one of the pews, even though the church had been empty when we were there. "The film must be damaged," Tommy said, but his voice was shaking. "All of it? Every single picture?" He didn't have an answer for that. That night, as we sat around our campfire, I played back the tape recordings I'd made during the day. Most of it was just our voices talking about what we saw. But in several places there were other sounds mixed in. Children's voices whispering things I couldn't understand, the sound of a ball bouncing, a music box playing a lullaby. "We need to talk to Ezra again," I said. Tommy nodded. "Yeah, first thing in the morning." But as we got ready for bed, I kept thinking about those 23 names on the class roster, 23 children who had died scared and alone, waiting for parents who never came back for them. What if they were still waiting? Ezra was waiting for us on his porch the next morning, like he knew we'd be back. "You heard them, didn't you?" he said, before we even got out of the Jeep. "Heard who?" Tommy asked, but I could tell he already knew. "The children. They've been trying to get someone's attention for 40 years now. Most folks who wander up there get scared and leave real quick. But you stayed. You listened." I sat down across from Ezra and looked him in the eye. "Tell me the truth. What really happened in Haven Ridge?" Ezra rocked in his chair for a minute, thinking. Then he said, "The government men came in 1952. Said they were going to build a dam and flood the whole valley. Told everybody they had to move or they'd be forced out. Most families started packing, but then the sickness came." "Diphtheria," I said. "That's what the doctors called it. But it wasn't natural the way it spread so fast and only took the young ones. 23 children dead in 7 days. The families were so broke up with grief they couldn't think straight. They just grabbed what they could carry and ran, leaving everything behind. Even left their babies buried in the family plots." "But the dam was never built," Tommy said. "No, the government changed their minds about the project after all them people were already gone. So Haven Ridge just sat there, empty, except it wasn't really empty." Ezra looked out toward the settlement, and I saw something in his eyes that looked like pain. "I was supposed to go with my family," he continued, "but I got sick too, and they thought I was going to die. When I got better, everybody was already gone. I was 12 years old, all alone in these mountains. I should have followed them, but I heard the children calling." "Calling?" "They were scared, Miss Elena. They didn't understand where their families went. They kept waiting and waiting, but nobody came back, so I stayed. Someone had to stay with them." That afternoon, Tommy and I went back to Haven Ridge, but this time we brought Ezra with us. As soon as we got to the settlement, things started happening. The first thing I noticed was the temperature. Even though it was still 90 degrees outside, some of the buildings felt like walk-in freezers. In Mary Catherine Whitman's bedroom, my breath came out in clouds. Then the sound started. Footsteps in the attic, doors opening and closing by themselves, the squeaky sound of the old well handle turning like someone was drawing water. And always, the sound of children playing somewhere just out of sight. "They're excited," Ezra said. "They don't get many visitors." Tommy was taking pictures again, but now the camera was working too well. Every shot showed children that we couldn't see with our eyes. A little boy playing with marbles on the church steps, twin girls braiding each other's hair in a bedroom window, a group of Kids playing hide and seek behind the general store. This is impossible, Tommy kept saying. Completely impossible. But around noon, something happened that made us all believe. We were in the schoolhouse when I heard a child's voice say, clear as anything, Miss Elena, will you read to us? I looked around, but there was nobody there. Just me, Tommy, and Ezra. Did you hear that? I asked. Tommy nodded, his face pale. A little girl. She called you Miss Elena. They think you're someone else, Ezra said quietly. Someone they remember. Who? Miss Sarah Beth. She was their teacher. She stayed with them when the sickness came, tried to take care of them when their parents were too scared to come close. She died with them, trying to save them. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air. What did she look like? Ezra studied my face. About your size. Brown hair like yours. Kind eyes. The children loved her. That's when I understood. The spirits thought I was their teacher, come back to take care of them. Miss Elena? The voice came again, and this time I could tell where it was from. The front of the classroom, where a teacher would stand. Hello, I said softly. Are you Mary Catherine? Yes, ma'am. We've been waiting for you. We've been so good, just like you told us to be. Tommy grabbed my arm. Dr. Ashworth, don't talk to it. But I couldn't help myself. Where are the other children, Mary Catherine? They're here. We're all here. We never left, just like you said. But we're getting lonely. When are our mamas coming back? I felt tears in my eyes. These children had been waiting 40 years for parents who were never coming back. I don't know, sweetheart, I whispered. That's when Tommy made his big mistake. He started yelling. This is crazy. You're talking to empty air. There's nobody there. He kicked over one of the small desks and it crashed to the floor. The temperature dropped another 20 degrees in about 2 seconds. The windows started rattling, and I could hear children crying. Tommy, stop! I shouted, but it was too late. Things started flying around the room. Books, chalk, pieces of broken wood. Something invisible shoved Tommy hard and he fell against the chalkboard. When he got up, there were long scratches across his back, like fingernails had raked him. We don't like loud noises, a boy's voice yelled. You scared the little ones. I'm sorry, I said quickly. He's sorry. We didn't mean to scare you. The flying stopped, but I could still hear children sniffling and whispering to each other. Tommy was shaking. Blood was seeping through his shirt from the scratches. We need to get out of here, he whispered. But when we tried to leave the schoolhouse, the door wouldn't open. We pushed and pulled, but it felt like something was holding it shut from the outside. Please let us go, I said to the air. We'll come back tomorrow. Promise? Mary Catherine's voice sounded so hopeful. I promise. The door swung open and we stumbled outside. Tommy was white as a sheet and kept looking over his shoulder like something was following us. They're real, he kept saying. They're actually real. That night, back at our camp, Tommy had a fever and kept talking in his sleep. He sounded like a scared little kid, speaking in the old mountain dialect I'd heard some of the older folks use. Don't leave us, he mumbled. Please don't leave us alone again. I knew then that we were in serious trouble. The children's spirits were so lonely and desperate for attention that they were starting to affect our minds. And tomorrow, I'd promised to go back. The next morning, Tommy couldn't remember his own name. He woke up confused, talking like a 6-year-old child, asking where his mama was and when he could go home. When I showed him his ID, he looked at it like he'd never seen it before. That's not my name, he said in a voice that sounded younger than his 24 years. My name is Samuel. Samuel Hayes. I live in Haven Ridge with my mama and papa. Samuel Hayes. I remembered that name from the class roster. A 9-year-old boy who died in 1952. I drove Tommy to Ezra's cabin, but the old man just shook his head when he saw him. The boy got too close, Ezra said. Sometimes the children try to share their bodies with living folks. Makes them feel alive again, but it ain't good for the living person. How do I fix him? You gotta convince the spirit to let go, but that ain't easy. The children have been lonely for so long they don't want to give up having someone to play with. I left Tommy with Ezra and drove back to Haven Ridge alone. I knew it was dangerous, but I had to help my student, and I was starting to understand that these children needed more than just attention. They needed someone to help them find peace. The settlement felt different when I arrived. The air was thick and heavy, like before a thunderstorm, even though the sky was clear. And for the first time, I could see them. 23 children, standing in the main street of the settlement, looking at me with hope and desperate longing. They looked exactly like they would have in 1952, worn clothes, bare feet, faces pale from sickness. But their eyes were bright and alive. "Miss Elena?" Mary Catherine ran to me and tried to take my hand. Her fingers felt cold and thin, like touching fog. "You came back. We knew you would." The other children crowded around me, all talking at once. "Will you teach us to read? Can we have school today? When are our families coming home? Are you staying this time?" I knelt down so I was at their eye level. "Children, I need to tell you something important. Can you all listen to me?" They got quiet and stood in a circle around me, just like kids in a classroom. "I know this is hard to understand, but your families can't come back. They had to leave a long time ago, and they can't return to Haven Ridge." "But you're here," said a little girl with pigtails. "You came back." "I'm not Miss Sarah Beth. I just look like he. Or my name is Elena, and I study old places like this one." "You're lying," a boy shouted. "You are too Miss Sarah Beth. You promised you'd take care of us." I know she promised that, and she tried to keep her promise. But Miss Sarah Beth got sick too, and she died with you. She's not alive anymore, and neither are you. The children stared at me. Some of them started crying. "We're not dead," Mary Catherine whispered. "We can't be dead. We're right here. We can talk and play and everything." "I know it's confusing, but you died during the diphtheria outbreak in 1952. Your bodies are buried in the family plots around the settlement. Your spirits stayed behind because you loved this place so much and because you were waiting for your families to come back." "You're wrong," Samuel Hayes' spirit shouted, the same Samuel who was possessing Tommy. "We're alive. We have to be alive." That's when I realized what I had to do. These children had died scared and alone, abandoned by the adults who were supposed to protect them. They couldn't move on because they didn't understand what had happened to them and because they still felt abandoned. "You're right," I said gently. "You are alive. Your spirits are alive, and your love for each other is alive, and your memories are alive. But your bodies died a long time ago, and that's why you feel so cold and lonely all the time." "What are we supposed to do?" Mary Catherine asked, tears streaming down her pale cheeks. "You're supposed to go to the place where people's spirits go when their bodies die. There's a beautiful place waiting for you, where you won't be cold or scared anymore. And Miss Sarah Beth is there, waiting to take care of you." "But what if our mamas and papas forget about us?" "They will never forget about you. Parents never forget their children, even when they die. Your families had to leave Haven Ridge because staying here hurt too much, but they never stopped loving you." I pulled out my notebook and started reading the names from the class roster. Mary Catherine Whitman, Samuel Hayes, Little, Beth Turner, Johnny Morrison, the Patterson twins, Sarah and Sally, Michael O'Brien. As I read each name, I told them they were loved, they were remembered, and it was okay for them to go. One by one, the children began to fade, like morning mist burning off in the sunlight. "Will you remember us too?" Mary Catherine asked as she started to disappear. "I promise I will remember you. I'll make sure other people remember you too." "Thank you, Miss Elena. Thank you for helping us understand." And then they were gone. The settlement felt different immediately, warmer, peaceful. Birds started singing in the trees, and I could hear insects buzzing in the grass. It was like the whole place had been holding its breath for 40 years and could finally breathe again. When I got back to Ezra's cabin, Tommy was himself again. He remembered everything that had happened, but he was deeply shaken by the experience of being possessed by Samuel Hayes' spirit. "I could feel what he felt," Tommy told me. "The confusion, the fear, the terrible loneliness. Those poor kids." Ezra had died peacefully in his sleep while I was at the settlement. I found him in his rocking chair on the porch, a gentle smile on his face. On the table next to him was a thick journal filled with 40 years of notes about caring for the children's spirits. Took care of them until someone better could come along, was the last entry. Now my watch is over. Time to go home. I tried to publish my findings, but no academic journal would accept a paper about real ghosts. The Park Service declared Haven Ridge structurally unsafe and blocked all public access. But I secretly installed a memorial plaque in the old church honoring the 23 children who died there. Tommy left graduate school and became a social worker, focusing on helping kids in foster care. He said he couldn't ignore what he'd learned about children who feel abandoned. I changed my research focus too. Instead of just documenting dying cultures, I started working with child welfare programs in isolated communities. I learned that the trauma of abandonment creates wounds that can last for generations. And sometimes, in special places like Haven Ridge, those wounds can leave marks on the world itself. Sometimes I still dream about the children. But now they're happy dreams. I see them playing in a sunny meadow, laughing and running with a kind woman who looks a little like me. Miss Sarah Beth, finally able to keep her promise to take care of them. The old-timers in the mountains have a saying, "Some spirits linger not from anger, but from love too strong to break with death." I used to think it was just folklore. Now I know better. The children of Haven Ridge taught me that love doesn't end when life does. Sometimes the strongest spirits are the smallest ones, and sometimes the most powerful hauntings come not from evil, but from hearts too young to understand goodbye. I've never been back to Haven Ridge, but I know it's at peace now. The children found their way home at last. My name is Clayton Boggs, and I've been a forest ranger in West Virginia for 8 years now. What I'm about to tell you happened back in June 1978, during the worst drought anyone could remember. I've never talked about it before, not to my wife, not to my boss, not even to the state investigators who came asking questions later. But I'm getting older now, and I figure someone should know the truth about what really lives in these mountains. I come from mountain people. My grandfather worked timber in these same hills, and my daddy mined coal before he got smart and became a ranger like me. I know these woods better than most folks know their own backyards. I can tell you which streams run year-round and which ones dry up come August. I know where the old Cherokee used to camp and where they buried their dead. I know the difference between a black bear track and a wild boar track in mud so thick you can't see your own boots. That summer, everything was wrong. We hadn't seen real rain since April, and it was killing everything. The big streams were down to trickles, and the little ones were just cracked mud. Dead fish floated in what water was left, and I spent most of my days hauling emergency water tanks to remote areas where the wildlife was dying of thirst. That's when they assigned Janet Kimball to work with me. She was fresh out of some fancy college in Pennsylvania, knew all about water management from textbooks, but had never actually seen a mountain stream dry up before. Nice enough girl, but she talked too much and jumped at every sound the forest made. On her first day, she asked if we had bears. I told her we had everything: bears, wildcats, rattlers, and things that didn't have names yet. The assignment was simple enough. Monitor the water levels in Serpent Branch, a spring-fed system that wound through 15 miles of old-growth forest. It was one of the last reliable water sources in our section, fed by underground springs that nobody had ever properly mapped. The Cherokee used to call it sacred water, and looking back, I should have paid more attention to that. Serpent Branch got its name from the way it twisted through the mountains like a snake. The main pool, what locals called Serpent Pool, was deep enough that nobody had ever touched bottom, even in dry years. Fish would gather there when all the other water dried up, and you could see them swimming in lazy circles, waiting for rain that never came. Janet and I set up our monitoring station on a ridge overlooking the pool. From there, we could see the whole system: the main pool, the smaller pools connected by narrow channels, and the spring heads that bubbled up from underground. Our equipment was basic stuff: pH test kits, depth measures, water temperature gauges, and a handheld radio that barely worked in the mountains. The first week was routine. We tested water samples, recorded levels, and filled out forms. Janet complained about the heat and the bugs, but she did her job. The water was cleaner than anything I'd seen, so pure it almost didn't seem real. Our equipment kept giving strange readings, like the water was somehow different from regular mountain water, but I figured it was just mineral content from deep underground. Then the animals started acting weird. Fish were swimming upstream, fighting against the current instead of conserving energy like they should during a drought. Deer wouldn't drink from certain pools, even though they were dying of thirst. I found a dead raccoon beside Serpent Pool one morning. No marks on it, just dead. When I picked it up, the fur was bone dry, like something had sucked all the moisture right out of it. Janet found the cave paintings on our second week. She was exploring upstream when she discovered a shallow cave, hidden behind some fallen rocks. Inside, painted on the smooth stone walls, were images that made my blood run cold. They showed a massive snake-like creature rising from water, with people kneeling around it in what looked like worship or maybe terror. The paintings were old, older than anything I'd seen before. That night we heard the first sounds from Serpent Pool. It started as splashing, like someone throwing rocks into the water. But there was nobody else around for miles, and the sounds came in patterns. 3 big splashes, then silence, then 3 more. Janet wanted to investigate with flashlights, but something about those sounds made my skin crawl. Instead, we sat by our campfire and listened. The splashing went on for hours. Sometimes it sounded like something big moving through the water. Other times like something was slapping the surface hard enough to echo off the canyon walls. Around midnight, everything went quiet, but that was worse than the noise. The silence felt heavy, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear something moving around our camp. Not footsteps exactly, but a sound like something heavy, dragging across the ground. When morning came, I found tracks in the soft mud by the water's edge. They weren't like anything I'd ever seen. Long and serpentine, about as wide as my outstretched hand, with deep grooves where claws had dug into the mud. The tracks went from the water up to the tree line, then disappeared on the rocky ground. I measured them, over 6 feet from tip to tip, and that was just one track. "What kind of animal makes tracks like that?" Janet asked, crouching beside me with her camera. I'd been asking myself the same question. "Nothing that should be living in these mountains," I said. We spent the morning taking pictures and measurements. The tracks were fresh, made sometime during the night while we were listening to that splashing. When we followed them away from the water, we found places where something had rubbed again. Saint trees, leaving marks 12 feet off the ground. Whatever made these tracks was big enough to reach that high without stretching. That afternoon, our equipment started going crazy. The pH readings jumped from normal to highly acidic to highly basic within minutes. The water temperature gauges showed impossible readings. One minute the water was near freezing, the next it was hot enough to boil. Janet thought the equipment was broken, but I was starting to think something else was going on. We were packing up for the day when Janet screamed. I spun around and saw her pointing at the water with a shaking hand. The surface of Serpent Pool was glowing. Not reflecting light, actually glowing with a soft green color that pulsed like a slow heartbeat. As we watched, the glow grew brighter, and shapes moved beneath the surface, too big and too fast to be fish. "Did you see that?" Janet whispered. "Something's down there, something huge." I saw it. A shadow the size of a school bus moving in the depths of the pool with smooth, undulating motions. For just a moment, part of it broke the surface. A section of what looked like dark, wet skin stretched over something massive. Then it disappeared back into the deep water, leaving only ripples and that eerie green glow. We backed away from the water's edge. The glow faded slowly, but I could still see shapes moving down there, too deep to make out clearly. My radio crackled with static, and for a second I could have sworn I heard something like a voice, speaking words I didn't understand. "We need to report this," Janet said, but her voice sounded far away, like she was talking through water. I tried the radio. Nothing but static and that strange voice-like sound, speaking in rhythms that almost sounded like the Cherokee chants my grandfather used to sing. When I looked back at Janet, She was swaying on her feet, staring at the water with unfocused eyes. "Janet!" I grabbed her arm and she snapped back to awareness. "What happened?" she asked, blinking rapidly. "I felt like something was calling me." Got out of there fast. But as we hiked back to our truck, I could hear something following us through the woods, not walking, but sliding over the ground with a sound like wet leather on stone. We never saw what was making the sound, but I could feel eyes watching us the whole way out. That night, I called my grandfather's old friend, Joseph Silverfish. He was Cherokee, in his 80s, and knew more about these mountains than any man alive. When I described what we'd seen, he went quiet for a long time. "You found the water keeper," he said finally. "We always knew it was there, sleeping in the deep places. But it only wakes up when the water is threatened." "Threatened how?" "Poisoned, stolen, destroyed." His voice was grave. "Something's got it angry, Clayton. Something's threatening the water, and now it's awake." The next morning I found out what he meant. A coal mining company had filed permits to divert Serpent Branch for a new slurry pond. They were planning to pump all that clean, sacred water into settling tanks full of mining waste. The waterkeeper wasn't just angry, it was protecting its home. The attacks started 3 days later. We got the call on our radio around dawn. Mining equipment at the upstream site had been destroyed overnight. Bulldozers flipped over, excavators torn apart like toys. The site foreman swore it looked like something with massive claws had gone crazy on everything mechanical. Company security found tracks in the mud around the equipment, but nobody could explain what kind of animal could flip a 10-ton bulldozer. Janet and I hiked up to see the damage. It was worse than the radio reports made it sound. Heavy machinery had been not just damaged but shredded, with metal torn like paper and hydraulic lines ripped out and knotted together. The claw marks in the steel were deep gouges that sparkled with moisture, like whatever made them was dripping wet. "This is impossible," Janet said, running her hands over a gouge in a bulldozer blade. "Nothing has claws this size." But I'd seen the tracks by Serpent Pool. I knew exactly what had done this. The mining company brought in security guards after that, men with rifles and floodlights who patrolled the site all night. They set up a command post in a trailer and installed motion sensors around the equipment. The foreman, a hard-faced man named Briggs, told us they'd shoot anything that came near their machinery. That night, Janet and I camped at our usual spot overlooking Serpent Pool. The water was glowing again, brighter than before, and we could see massive shapes moving just beneath the surface. The whole pool seemed to be alive, pulsing with that green light like a giant heart. Around midnight, we heard gunshots from upstream, lots of them, rifles firing in rapid bursts, then stopping, then starting again. The radio crackled with panicked voices. "It's huge!" someone screamed. "The damn thing's huge! Fall back! Fall back!" Then silence. Janet wanted to investigate, but I held her back. Whatever was happening up there, we didn't want any part of it. We sat by our fire and waited for dawn, listening to the sounds echoing through the canyon. Crashes, screams, and something else, a sound like rushing water mixed with a voice calling out in some language that made my bones ache. When morning came, we hiked to the mining site. 2 of the security guards met us at the tree line, both pale and shaking. One had claw marks across his chest, shallow but clearly made by something with razor-sharp talons. "It came out of the water," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Thing was 40 feet long, easy. Moved like a snake but had arms, had claws. Eyes like amber lanterns. When it looked at you, it was like it could see right through you, down to your sow. Damn." The 3rd guard was missing. We found his rifle bent into a pretzel and thrown into a tree. His boots were sitting beside a pool of water that hadn't been there the day before, water that glowed faintly green even in daylight. "Where's the body?" Janet asked. "Ain't no body," the guard said. "Thing took him down into the water. We could hear him calling for help from way down deep, but the sound got fainter and fainter until it just stopped." The mining foreman wanted to call in the National Guard, but his company bosses told him to keep it quiet. They brought in more guards, bigger guns, and a team of what they called wildlife specialists, who were really just hunters with fancy equipment. They were going to kill the waterkeeper and get back to business. That's when Janet made her mistake. She'd been acting strange since our first encounter with the creature, spending hours staring into the water and talking about voices she claimed to hear. I thought it was just stress, but looking back, I think the thing had gotten into her head somehow, been calling to her in dreams. The night before the hunters arrived, she slipped away while I was asleep. I woke up to find her boots by our tent and her footprints leading down to Serpent Pool. The water was glowing so bright it lit up the whole canyon, and I could see her standing waist-deep in the pool, her arms stretched out like she was welcoming something. I ran toward the water, shouting her name, but I was too late. The creature rose from the depths like a prehistoric god coming to life. 40 feet of serpentine muscle covered in dark, wet skin that gleamed in the green light. It had a snake's body but with powerful arms that ended in claws like curved swords. Its head was massive, intelligent, with those amber eyes that seemed to hold thousands of years of memory and rage. Janet wasn't afraid. She was smiling as the creature wrapped around her with movements gentle as a mother holding a child. It lifted her from the water and looked at me with those ancient eyes, and for a moment, I heard its voice, in my head, speaking words I understood without hearing them. She will see what you have done to the water. She will understand why I wake. Then the creature sank back into the pool, taking Janet with it, leaving me alone on the shore with the terrible knowledge that I was the only one who knew the truth about what lived in Serpent Branch. I dove into the pool without thinking. The water was warm, almost hot, and thick as soup. As I sank deeper, the green glow grew brighter, showing me things I wish I'd never seen. The pool wasn't just deep. It was connected to a whole system of underwater caves that stretched for miles through the mountain. And in those caves, swimming through water that had never seen sunlight, were creatures that should have been extinct for millions of years. I saw fish with legs, salamanders the size of alligators, and things that had no names in any language. This wasn't just a pool. It was an ancient world, preserved in the deep places where time moved differently. The waterkeeper wasn't a monster. It was a guardian, protecting the last refuge of creatures that once ruled the earth. I found Janet in a huge cavern deep underground, sitting on a shelf of rock with her feet in the glowing water. She was alive but changed, her eyes reflecting green light like the creature's. When she saw me, she smiled, but it wasn't her smile anymore. "Do you see now?" she said, her voice echoing strangely in the cavern. "Do you understand what they're trying to destroy?" The waterkeeper floated beside her, its massive head just above the surface. When it looked at me, images flooded my mind. Visions of the mountains as they used to be, with clean rivers and pure springs feeding an ecosystem that stretched back to the beginning of time. Then I saw what was coming: the mining, the pollution, the slow death of everything the creature had protected for centuries. "As they want to poison the water," Janet said. "Turn this into a dump for coal waste. Kill everything that lives here." The creature's voice filled my head again, not words, but understanding. It had tried to scare the miners away, but they kept coming back with bigger guns and more men. Soon they would bring explosives, blast open the underground caves, and fill them with toxic sludge. Everything in this ancient ecosystem would die, and the creature would die with it. "What do you want me to do?" I asked. The amber eyes fixed on mine, and I saw the answer. The creature needed an ally on the surface, someone who could protect the water using human laws and human ways. It had chosen me, just like it had chosen my grandfather's grandfather, who had made a pact with it years ago that his family had forgotten. "I have to stay," Janet said. "Someone has to witness what happens here. Someone has to remember." Above us, explosions echoed through the water. The mining company had brought dynamite, trying to collapse what they thought was a simple cave system. They had no idea they were about to destroy something that had existed since before humans walked the earth. The waterkeeper let out a sound I felt in my bones, part roar, part song, part cry of rage that had been building for decades. The cavern shook, and I knew that whatever happened next would change everything. Go, Janet said. Stop them before it's too late. I swam back through the glowing water as the creature rose from the depths behind me, its massive form moving with deadly purpose toward the surface. When I broke through into daylight, I could see the mining crew on the far shore, setting charges around what they thought were the spring heads feeding Serpent Pool. The waterkeeper erupted from the pool like a missile, water cascading from its serpentine body as it rose 40 feet into the air. For a moment, it hung there in the sunlight, terrible and beautiful, its amber eyes blazing with fury. Then it came down among the miners like the wrath of nature itself. What followed wasn't a battle. It was a reckoning. The creature moved through the mining camp with supernatural speed, its claws tearing through equipment and sending men running for their lives. But it wasn't trying to kill them. It was trying to save the water. Every explosive charge was destroyed. Every pump was shredded. Every piece of machinery that threatened the ecosystem was reduced to scrap metal. The men with guns fired until their ammunition ran out, but the bullets seemed to pass through the creature without effect. It was made of water and time and the deep places where life began, and mortal weapons couldn't touch something that old. As I watched from the pool's edge, storm clouds gathered overhead with impossible speed. The creature lifted its head to the sky and called out in a voice like thunder, and the heavens answered. Rain began to fall, not the gentle summer rain we'd been praying for, but a torrential downpour that turned the entire canyon into a rushing river. The mining camp washed away in minutes. Equipment, trailers, and vehicles tumbled downstream in the flood, leaving nothing but bare rock and the sound of clean water flowing where it was meant to flow. The men who survived would tell stories, but nobody would believe them. They'd say it was freak weather, a flash flood, an act of God. They'd be right about that last part. That was 27 years ago, and Serpent Branch still flows clean and free. The mining company never came back, blamed the incident on geological instability, and found easier places to dig their holes. The Cherokee tribe quietly reclaimed the area as sacred land, and the state eventually made it part of the wilderness preserve. Janet never came back to the surface. I filed a report saying she was swept away in the flood, and her body was never found. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the water glows green, I can see her sitting by the edge of Serpent Pool, watching over the ancient things that swim in the deep places. I left the Ranger Service after that and spent the rest of my career fighting mining companies, using laws and lawyers instead of claws and teeth. I've saved a lot of water in my time, but I've never forgotten that some guardians are older than our laws, and they remember what we've forgotten about living with the land. The waterkeeper still lives in Serpent Pool. I've seen it a few times over the years, usually when some fool politician starts talking about developing natural resources in the area. It surfaces just long enough to remind people that some things are more valuable than money, then disappears back into the depths where time moves differently and ancient promises are still kept. My grandson asked me once why I spend so much time fighting for clean water. I told him that some responsibilities get passed down through families, and our job is to protect the things that can't protect themselves. But that's not the whole truth. The real truth is that there are guardians in the deep places, watching and waiting. They've been patient for a long time, but their patience isn't endless. And when they finally decide that we can't be trusted with the water that gives us life, they'll come up from the deep places to take it back. I've seen what that looks like, and I wouldn't wish it on anyone. The Cherokee were right. Serpent Branch is sacred water. And sacred things have guardians that remember when the world was clean, when the water ran pure, and when people understood their place in the great web of life that connects all things. We forgot those lessons, but the waterkeeper remembers. And as long as it swims in the deep places where time began, the water will flow clean and free, protected by something older and wiser than our greed. That's the real story of what happened in Jefferson National Forest in the summer of 1978. I'm telling it now because I'm getting old, and someone needs to know. Someone needs to remember that we're not alone in these mounds. Tains and the things that live in the deep places are watching everything we do. Next time you see a spring bubbling up from underground or a pool so deep you can't see the bottom, remember this story. Remember that some water is sacred, and sacred things have guardians. And if you ever see amber eyes watching you from the depths, show respect. The water keepers are older than our civilization, and they remember everything we've forgotten about what it means to belong to the land instead of owning it. The water flows clean because someone stands guard in the deep places. And that's the way it should be.